up. After they go through that, the ink will have a certain pattern in the chromatogram, and we'll compare that, to which printer produces ink, or which ink produces that, and we can actually find, a new lead in the investigation. We'll say, okay, we know the printer ink that was on this bomb threat paper, letter was a certain kind of ink. Well, who bought ink in the past month? Maybe we can find out from that who actually sent this letter. Again, these are some of the things you can do once you analyze the ink and relate it to. You can analyze the ink. You can analyze the way the ink is on the paper. These are ways of connecting the criminals to the crime scene, or at least the printer to the printed paper of the question document. There's another thing that but by the way, this earlier thing of identifying the printer, that is only class. It's only a class characteristic. You can, because there's more than one printer. Many printers are sold, so you might be able to relate it to one printer, but you might not be one class of manufactured printer, but you might not relate it to a single person's printer. So that's a class characteristic. This, however, sometimes the printing device, the paper rolls through rollers in order to get out, usually. So these rollers might have a little bit of a bump or a scratch, and will actually introduce some blemishes onto the paper. This is an individual characteristic, because every roller, let's say, will have different scratches. So we can print an exemplar from the suspect's printer, and we'll see the same blemishes in the same pattern on the paper. We'll say, aha, this person and this person's printer must have printed out that, let's say, letter along with a letter bomb. So these, by the way, change over time, because again, the thing keeps rolling and rolling, and these blemishes might get smoothed out or stretched out. And in a way, this can actually show this might be very different by the time we get to the exemplar. It might have changed. Or another thing is if we find the printer that printed the question document, we might be able to find the time that question document was done, and with that we can find the person who was using it at that time. For example, if let's say it was known that on this office the printer had a certain blemish. It started off small and got bigger and bigger and bigger, and our question document has this blemish that of a certain size. We say, well, it was only that size, in a certain date. It started, let's say, January 1st. It got really big in January 29th, and this was a medium size. So we pretty much know this is around the middle of January. So who was in the office in the middle of January? And we can possibly narrow down our suspects. So on the one hand, if it changes, these changes might prevent you from relating the actual blemish of the printer to the blemish on the question document. But on the other hand, it can actually be very valuable, because if we know how it changed, we might know when the person used it. We might know when that paper was printed, when the blemish was in a certain way at that certain time, and we can actually identify when it was done, and therefore possibly the people who used it at the time. Another thing, when it comes to fax machines, again, fax machines use often printers or printing devices to print it out, so everything we said before is true for fax machines, but there's an additional idea of a fax machine. They automatically put what they call a transmitting terminal identifier at the top of their page. This has the phone number of the machine and the time that it was sent. So if we, in our question document, we have that, well, that kind of tells us, where did it come from? And it's different for different fax machines, so we can actually tell often the fax machine that it came from. So not just the phone number, not just the place, but also the kind of fax machine sometimes. People can falsify that. Let's say they falsify a fax machine message. what they would do is they put a different TTI on the top. But it's not easy because you can usually tell by the way it's slanted, the way it's angled, the different kind of printing. Generally, these are not falsified successfully. So so you have a fax machine message. That's one thing we immediately look for. Where did it come from? What's the TTI? As it turns out, they do have a database of different kinds of printing from different kinds of printers and all different kinds of models. And for whatever reason, it's the U.S. Secret Service that has this database. I don't know, maybe because the president gets a lot of typewritten threats or printed threats, so they really have to find out where all these typewritten things came from or printed papers came from, so they have a database and all that. Whatever it is, they're the ones who have the database and they run it, so if people have a question document that they need, they have to go to the U.S. Secret Service for their database. And as mentioned before, usually if you want to get specific information, you use a microscope to analyze the print, how the print ended up on the paper, and get information as to what kind of device, what make, what model, whatever it might be, printed the question document that was received. That's okay. That's true for the document itself. And however, parts of the document were altered. They were erased, or had things added to them, where the document itself was valid, but some little part of it was changed in a way that benefits the criminal. Like a $1,000 check, you change it to a $10,000 check, right? I mean, all you do is a little zero, so the guy might be making a lot of money illegitimately. So the check was legitimate, but how do you know it was 1,000 or 10,000? They might have erased something. Let's say a certain part of a document that this is null and void if, and they erase that part. Usually these are obvious under a microscope, especially lighted from the sides. You can usually tell where the erasure marks are, where the original writing was, because of the way when you shine a light from the side, little indentations produce shadows that are noticeable. So that's oblique lighting, when you shine the light from an unusual angle, usually an angle from the side or an unusual angle. This will again produce shadows where the original indentations of the original writing were, or we can see where the erasures were put on the paper by the shadows of the oblique that come from oblique lighting. So under a microscope, you can usually find these erasures. That's an erasure. It's like a falsified or forced erasure, like using something to rub it out. But what if a chemical erasure was done, like where it was just dissolved off? These also can be seen under a microscope. They're like faded or discolored marks because, again, you put a chemical on a paper, you're going to change the paper in a certain way. Also, we can examine these areas, the areas where we suspect the erasure under UV, it's ultraviolet or IR infrared light. Now we use visible light. Ultraviolet is light of a shorter wavelength, of a higher frequency. And this light reflects off of the writing in a different way than visible light does. And erasures will actually cause this light to reflect in a different way. Usually, it might glow more or less, and we can see that something strange going on because it's reflecting in a strange way at this point where we suspect the erasure is. Similarly, infrared light will, when we shine it on there, it can the way the light reflects and it reflects off of it and gets into our eyes. When we can see it, when we see the reflected light, or using an IR detector.